I'll open this meeting of the Planning Committee for today, the 4th of July, and acknowledge my councillor colleagues, Mayor Phil Goff, councillors and Independent Māori Statutory Board members, Leanne Namani and Tauhanari, all members of the committee for today. And at the outset, members, I'll just let you know that we will be deferring confidential item C3, and I will give the greater depth of reason when we come to that item. Just remind the members that following this session, immediately following this Planning Committee meeting today, we're all gathering to look at the report template for our business meeting. So if we can just mark that in our diaries, if it's not already marked. Welcome to members of the public and media and those that might be tuning in for this meeting of the Planning Committee. I will firstly take apologies, and I have received apologies from Councillor Collins, Councillor Clow for early departure, Councillor Collins, Councillor Fletcher and Councillor Hulse for absence, and from Councillor Hills and Councillor Mike Lee for absence on council business. And can I have a second for those apologies? I'll move.
Thank you, Sweet.
I think I heard Councillor Filipina, thank you. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare those carried. I've received no declarations of interest ahead of the meeting. Are there any declarations of interest on any topic before us here today, be it open agenda or confidential agenda, members? There being none, I'll move to confirmation of the minutes and move accordingly confirmation of the meeting minutes, both open and confidential agendas for the 6th of June. I have a second from the Deputy Chair. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you. There are no public petitions arranged for this meeting, which takes us to public input. Members, there are two requests for public input, which I've recommended be deferred to the meeting where the subject matters will be discussed on the agenda. And I thank Charlotte Fisher for her interest in the future of the tank farm. And Charlotte Fisher will come to us at the meeting where we discuss that, which is forthcoming. And Simon Shepherd also wanted to look at the Wynyard Peninsula. There's a workshop coming up, a half-day workshop on everything waterfront. As you will be aware of, it will be in your diaries very soon, and following that we'll be having business meetings to discuss a number of things related to the port, and that will be the appropriate time for Charlotte and Simon to attend the public input session of our business meeting. I've had a further request for representation here today in the public input session from Nick Roberts, planning consultant representing Kiwi Property Group and Fulton Hogan. That has to do with the Fulls item, I think the second item on our agenda today, second major item of business. And I've declined that, members. The request was made out of time. You'll recall there is a time constraint as per standing orders, and also for the reason that it's post-deliberations. The Fulls has been through an open and transparent process. 189 written submissions have been received, considered and deliberated on, and we have the recommendation from the deliberations panel before us today. So I think that handles what has been deferred or declined, but I have accepted two requests today from Claudia Moran, who we'll hear from first up, and Claudia is going to give us a presentation on something which is not on the agenda and not due to be on the agenda, so it's appropriate that it does come here today. And we'll also hear from the Kumu Huapai Residents and Ratepayers Association, Pete Sinton and Craig Walker, on matters relating to their association and the geographical area that they have influence over. So that is the summary, and I welcome first up Claudia Moran. Is Claudia, yes, hello Claudia. Welcome to the Planning Committee. And we have your presentation loaded, Claudia, and I think you can operate it from where you are seated.
It's just, okay, perfect.
Welcome.
I also supplied a one-pager. I don't know if she emailed it to everyone.
I believe that's been distributed.
That goes along with the presentation, just with little points.
I'll just remind members it's on the hub system, and if you don't have access to that right now, we've got a hard copy for you. If you can just let us know if you'd like the hard copy.
Okay, thank you for having me and accepting my request, Mr. Chair. My name is Claudia Moran. On a community level, I am a member of the Ponsonby Community Center Board. I also run the local play group, which I've run for 3 years in Ponsonby. But this is just specifically an opportunity that I wanted to highlight to the Planning Committee. So first of all, it's a place for everyone. So I don't know if you're familiar with the area, but if you have the sheet, it's a site that's located on Ponsonby Road that in the one page you can see was an article in 2006 that Auckland Council purchased the land for the Civic Square. So that's over 10 years ago. So with the fan trail and stuff, I was showing that this is a place that it's an opportunity to provide water, toilets, and a meeting place. The rehabilitation, development, or preservation of public space is the clearest way for council to communicate its vision and influence to the people. For instance, these are places around America where this here is the San Francisco Presidio. So you have easier, versatile seating and little play areas. So all cities with a vision to be world-class and livable for their populations are facilitating the rehabilitation and development of public space throughout the communities they serve. So the main point of this presentation is that if you do it in Ponsonby, where there's already people walking past it every day, and you do it light, quick, and cheap, it'll be an easy model to replicate throughout other areas of Auckland, such as Titirangi or the North Shore, on areas that are available. It just so happens that we actually own this site. The council owns it. So these are just more samples. This is a pocket park in Wall Street that has security, seating. It's relatively used. This is in Venice, bike chairs. And this is actually an art piece reused from Burning Man. So just showing examples of cheap, easy ways to get art in public space. There's a renaissance in the public realm.
And if you could point at that one for the benefit of members over the side.
Oh, this one? Oh, wait, so that one too, okay. So there's a global renaissance all over the world for the public realm. So this is in San Carlos. And here, for instance, this has been 5 years running because I visit regularly to see my nieces. And they always have these events on, art, Coachella, music, movies in this square. And on the right is actually Christchurch. So they have yoga in the square. These are all free public events that aid for livability and opportunity. This is actually taken from the Auckland-wide quality of life graph commissioned by Auckland Council, showing all the different benefits of specifically public realms. So benefits are on the community are widely known. A meeting point, a place for public expression, gives everyone a sense of belonging and is proven to help the community thrive, arts, recreation, and mental health. And yes, there are a handful of projects underway across the city, but this is one very important, highly publicized opportunity that was promised to the community and has continually been overlooked. This is a Auckland Council commissioned drawing of what could be in that corner on the site. There's the actual measurements for the site in your one-pager. And each time these surveys come out to the local community, we get very excited. We talk about it. It becomes a speaking point. And then as it gets deferred every 10-year plan, I as a community member, and I go to lots of Waitemata meetings, have to answer to my community about what's the progress. This is a bit of history. Some of it's in the one-pager. In 2000, I have a hard copy, and if you're interested, I can email hard copies. Auckland Council commissioned a report specifically on open space needs in the city. And yes, we have Western Park, and yes, we have Toll Street Park, but it's about visibility and toilets and seating for people using that main strip and walking, let's say, towards the fan zone for Eden Park. there's a large gap there. So as far as 2016 years ago, Boff Miskell, it's in the Auckland Council history. I tried to get it from the National Library, but they say it's in the Auckland Council files, but I have a soft copy I can email, and I have a hard copy here. And in that report, it specifically cited that area near Three Lamps needed open space. And then in 2006, the Auckland Council purchased the land specifically for a square, with the possibility of development, but as years go on and urbanization and density increases, we more and more are hoping to have the whole site as a open square. So when they did the last survey, which was in 2000, also council funded, they did this survey, which I have a soft copy on our website, Auckland Waitemata. They gave 3 options, one with some development, one with little development, and one open site. 77%, everyone that responded wanted open site. And then after that, it inspired another community-led group. And the Waitemata gave us $10,000 to see the interest in the site. And that was 2 years ago almost. And our latest survey on Ponsonby Park through internet and in person got 1,200 submissions. So 1,200 people took the time to fill out a survey on why they want the park, how it can help. And it's an example that if you wanted to do this in other areas throughout other wards, you know before you go how much people want it, and then once they answer the survey, they're the ones you go to as you build, as you see how you can fund this. But you already get the interest before you even start. So, for instance, Myers Park, before they did all that development, spent millions of dollars, they only had 43 submissions. Grayland Park, before they did the playground and other areas of that, only 70, and we had 1,200. Why is Ponsonby important? Ponsonby is the heart of the city. It is a cultural hub. It is in the prime position in a thriving suburb, loved by the local community and Aucklanders and tourists alike. So I guess I'm almost done, so that's 5 minutes, I guess. What we need from you is don't delay the park for another decade, as they did in previous councils as it comes to the agenda. See the value in it, enter in a participatory collaboration with community, approve funding for the million, or just place it in the budget, that a possibility of $1 million. And with the Waitemata, I've already started working with not-for-profits to fund it. I'm confident I can get the money to do the Apex. We just need that site now, if you've noticed, is missing a tenant, and it's a liquor store. So for our community, we're looking at an empty Nosh site that used to be a market that's going to be empty for a while to get tenants that can afford it, and a liquor store, which is kind of not good for children, i.e. So just a dead site that we thought could be a park. And I have more articles from Paperboy and that. I'm open to questions. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, Claudia. Are there questions for Claudia on this? So this is, members, this is probably one of our early 10-year budget submissions in some respects. So thanks for being first out of the block, Claudia. Questions for Claudia, members? Councillor Casey.
Just a comment, Claudia, as one of the Auckland City Councillors who was in the room making that decision at the time, it was indeed always earmarked for a park. And I agree with everything you've said. It should still be a park.
Thank you.
Anybody else with a question for Claudia? Claudia, I think you've outlined the issue very well. You've signalled it for consideration in our 10-year budget framing. We're at the very early stages of that, and I'm sure it will be in the mix. And I do recall, I think Hello Sailor performed from the roof of the liquor store there, didn't you?
I wasn't familiar with that, but that's exactly an opportunity we're hoping for.
I'm a Ponsonby resident from a way back, you see. Councillor Casey, would you like to move?
I'd love to move.
Appreciation?
Yes.
And we'll do that. Do I have a second? Councillor Watson, thank you. So look, thank you, Claudia. This is really valuable, and we'll convey this information that you've put on the table today, which we've received formally. We're thanking you, and we'll make sure we address the matter that you've raised, as will the Waitemata Agreement, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Much appreciated. And I'll put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. We'll now have a presentation from the Kumu Huapai Residents and Ratepayers Association, Pete Sinton and Craig Walker. Welcome, gentlemen.
Said her water believes the city. I remember that. I'm supporting this
Peter, you going to open up?
My learned colleague, Peter,
Learned.
will lead the charge.
Learned from the West, good. We've got 5 minutes by standing orders. If we can just leave some time for questions at the end there, that's good.
Mr. Chairman, firstly, thank you for giving us some time to come in front of the council. And I've got Craig Walker, who's my deputy chair, but he's pretty much an expert in heavy haulage in New Zealand and has been recognised nationally for that. So Craig sort of runs 2IC to me in ratepayers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a town planner by profession. I live in Kumeu. My ancestors have been there since 1860, so we've got deep roots in the place. And I have been chairman for 8 years. So, you know, planners are not the most popular profession out in the West, and to be still in the chair in 8 years, I must be doing something that meets community aspirations. I've left with the council 3 documents today, Mr. Chairman. One is just an overall, a brief summary of where we're at, and the second is a summary of what we think the council should be doing, and the third is the 3 maps, just to give you, and I'll refer back to the maps as I go. Knowing I haven't got much time, I'd like to acknowledge the Mayor and his involvement coming out to Kumeu in the past, and I know you've listened, and we're very grateful for that. I'd also like to acknowledge Penny Holtz. I know she's not here, but the last time I was here, chaired the Development Committee, and we managed to convince the council to hold any more SHAs from coming to the district, other than the 2 that were forced on us. So, yeah, Penny, we were grateful for that. Also, Greg Sayers has been great since he's been in office, and I'm sure everyone's noticed the election majority that he got in the last election. And he's certainly been instrumental in helping us forward things. Mr. Chair, the unitary plan process, we're the only group in the district that actively participated in the unitary plan process, making sure that the growth in our district was what we wanted and where we wanted it. As you probably know, we're now, and we're not stopping growth. We're not anti-growth. What we want is controlled and correctly planned growth. We're not getting that. Now, what we've got in Kumeu is a growth that we've confirmed through the association, and it's also confirmed by your planners, that we're getting 30 to 35,000 people in our district, where there was about 6 to 7 before. So it's a huge increase with no formal structure planning being in place. Council correctly identify us as a rural township, and I'd like to take that on board. We're not another suburb of Auckland to be urbanised with, the cancer of urban growth. We're still a rural township, and we're fighting strong to maintain that character. So we're getting the size of Whanganui or Timaru into Kumeu, just to give you some idea, with no formal structure planning in place. The growth that in the next 5 years, Mr. Chairman, from what we know as of today, there's about 1,500 homes coming into the Huapai Triangle, and for those of you who have a look at the main map, it's that yellow piece in the middle of the lime green. That's the Huapai Triangle. There's 2,000 homes already under the old Rodney scheme that's zoned in Huapai, and most of that's under development and well over 2/3 completed. There's another 230 homes in the Oroha Road SHA approved by the Minister. So it equates to about 10,000 people coming to our district in 5 years without any further structure planning being done. And it doesn't equate or account for, and because we haven't done the exercise yet, what the council and the commissioners approved for countryside living, because there's a live zone in what is that brown area, Mr. Chairman, between Whenuapai and Kumeu, which is now live as a zone and is being subdivided as I speak. So it's going to happen into either 1 hectare or 2 hectare blocks, And so the increase in development potential in that area is quite huge, and it's going to happen in five years in my big, because there's a lot happening right now. So in summary, we're getting about a third of our growth that I can estimate, and about a sixth of the time. In other words, it's not a 30-year spread evenly over that time. It's coming quicker than what we've got. Transport planning. In 2014, Mr. Chairman, we had a meeting, and I asked Penny Webster to call it out at Solgens with NZTA, Auckland Transport, New Zealand Rail, Education Board. So we had all the heads there to talk about where we're going as a district. The appalling situation we had was that we had the zoning prepared by planners here, but the transport planners hadn't even started. You know, that was at the end of 2014. Of course, that was in the process of the unitary plan process. So, you know, on one hand, the zoning was advanced, but no transport solutions there, and that's still basically the case that we've got now, except that we have got a unitary plan, we have got live zoning for parts of Kumeu and in the countryside living. The land supply strategy, you know, I'm sure you're well aware that our area is designated for growth or to be live in 228, you know, and the planners are saying they want to start the structure plan in 225. We're politely saying to you that's far too late, because the growth is happening now, and we need to have that framework plan, or whatever you're going to want to call it, happening now so that mistakes are not made in the future. So, and what we've, and Craig's used the word ad hoc developments more than I do, but what we've been getting, and we've had it from the Minister, of course, with the SHAs, is these dumped on developments and through an SHA in an area that's inappropriate with no infrastructure to back it up. Right? So that's been our problem. So if the land supply strategy is not going to start until 225, which is what we've been told from the reports and from the board and what have you, we're just saying that's far too late, Mr. Chairman. You know, we've got a train that's running pretty hot now for development and with no planning done. So the association's position has been very clear. We've been very consistent to both the council and to the board. For the last 6 years, we've seen little of forward planning being done. What has been done by the Minister under the SHA legislation, or been operative. So we'd like to see the council bring forward, and it was passed in our AGM, that a structure plan for Kumeu be brought forward from the period of 225, which it's earmarked for now. We've had a meeting with NZTA. We've had several meetings, thanks to Greg, and with the Rodney board. So they're well aware that we're coming today and been consistently asking for planning being brought forward in a comprehensive way. So what we're asking the board is not for money. What we're asking for is a joint team approach to look at, we call it the planning and transport plan for both NZTA and Auckland Transport. So we're calling it a Kumeu and Districts Framework and Transport Plan, because that's the framework is about the densities and timing and all that sort of thing, and the transport is clearly an issue that has to be part of that. We don't want it to be a statutory document. We want it to be so that the council know the general where the development should go. That's missing in Kumeu now for the growth that we've got. So, have I got time to just quickly summary?
We're up on time, but if you'd like to wrap it up and just leave your final message, Pete, that's fine.
So what we see is that a framework and transport plan is absolutely essential to start now. You know, we've come openly and saying, Council, we'd like you to join with us to do that. We have NZTA on board after a bit of negotiation. They see the merit in sitting with the community to sort out the transport solution. We need some of the council staff to be part of a team. And that's what we're asking directly of this development committee. We're not asking for the funds because we have to work out what we have to do, and there's a lot of work to do in that. We see the advantages of a joint approach, that it means that the residential densities are known, Mr Chairman. You know, we've already done, and I've left you a plan that was submitted
With that, yes?
that I did myself. NZTA and Auckland Transport want to be part of that. But I think one of the great advantages that the council has is that if a framework plan's in place, it will enable you and us, because we have to put up with what happens, to resist any forced zoning changes or intensive residential development by central government or private scheme changes that are inappropriate in our area. And at the moment, you haven't got any protection, and nor do we. And it gives clarity for the infrastructure and what's got to happen. To me, a collaborative approach is going to save you time and money, right? At the moment, it's fragmented and it's taking too long. So
We'll have to wrap it there, Pete. Are you just about done? Are they all your notes?
Yeah.
I think we've got the message pretty clear. I'll ask Jacques Victor, who's standing at the Chief of Strategy, Jim Quinn, today. Jacques, can you give both Pete and Craig and the members an update on the structure planning for that area?
So at the moment, the town centre plan is being done, and so that will be finished. You're absolutely right. The full sequence is the area in around 2028, and yes, the structure planning happens before that. The committee will next month consider the structure plan program that it will be doing over the next year, and so it is going to have to be part of the consideration of the whole program. Obviously, in terms of the falls, the structure planning needs to be done across the region, depending on the rollout of the falls, and so that will have to be considered as part of that.
So, members, we were due to have a report this agenda for planning going forward, structure planning, etc. But a little bit more work to do. So timely, and your presentation here today is timely, and will be more fully informed for the next business meeting. Councillor Watson and then Councillor Sayers.
Thank
Questions,
you.
please.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thanks, Pete and Craig. You mentioned in the interim this framework and transport plan that we'd like to see happen between like now basically and the end of next year. In the event that the council perhaps couldn't resource it or couldn't fund it, how would you build up a community funded budget to do that? Do you have any specific ideas? I know you made a couple of general observations here, but do you have something a little bit more tangible?
Well, I'm keeping the money out of it at the moment, but I have actually done a budget, and I've already had an offer from a planning consultant for over 50k to the association to do some work. We also know that NZTA have a part of that budget. They've already got their money in place. It's just making sure they realise that part of what they're already doing is part of what would be in a framework plan. So I think we need to come back, if you agree in principle with what I said today, with the work that needs to be done, and I've given a time frame that I think it's realistic for, because the NZTA don't move that quickly, you know, and they've got their own timelines for the state highway improvement and what have you. So 18 months, I think, is a realistic time frame to do it, but we would clearly have to come back with a budget on and matching it with work. Council have already done, you know, you're talking about the centre plan. Well, you know, begs the question where the centre's really, you know, for 35,000 people, really where it should be and how it should be. So the money side of it needs to be tagged to what has already been done and what needs to be done.
But a substantial component coming in from somewhere other than council.
NZTA.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if the council say, in principle, yes to what we're asking for here, it makes it a lot easier for me and the committee to go out and find some funds. So if you say no, then we're on a different plan, you know, because the ratepayers are not going to stop. All right? Make it quite clear about that. We know that this has to be done.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Sayers?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And good to see you both, Pete and Craig. Thanks for your presentation, and I guess the hub of it, you're looking for agreement in principle to do that framework plan. So my question is around that the Auckland Unitary Plan says that subdivisions shouldn't occur within the future urban zone, that that structure plans need to be done before that subdivisions happen, and that they shouldn't occur without the prior delivery of the appropriate infrastructure in place. So with all those safeguards that are outlined in the unitary plan that would happen, what do you think the risks are to council by not doing this framework plan, Pete? In other words, putting it another way, if you got a no in principle of not doing this framework plan, what would be, I guess, your attitude or approach in that case? And you were just starting to elaborate on that, on Mr. Watson's question.
Well, the risks, we've already got, if you look back in history, with the minister already putting 2 SHAs, and he came and announced the first ones in Huapai, so he was in our patch when the news was broken. So if there's no framework plan there, there's a risk that the government can come over the top of the council to do exactly what's happened in the past. And if you do have a framework plan there, you've got something in which to say, this is the densities and this is what we see, Minister, before you start imposing something different. From the community's point of view, we can't afford to take that risk any longer, Mr. Chairman, and Councillor. We just can't afford to take that risk because we have to wear what the end result. You don't, we do.
And it was quite clear when the Oroha Road SHA, for example, Greg, was implemented, that the minister had a responsibility to make sure the infrastructure was there. Well, they only looked to the front gate of the subdivision. They didn't look 1 kilometre down the road. So therein lies the danger. I mean, that SHA should have been legally challenged and stopped. Strictly under the standing rules of what the minister could or couldn't do. So therein lies the forward danger. And that could happen again. It could happen again on a private basis too.
Well, the part of the future urban zoning in your scheme, which you've approved, encourages the private sector to bring private plan changes forward, right? But if you don't have an overall structure on how that can fit, then it's just on a ad hoc basis. And there's a huge risk for the council and the community.
It'll be like Henderson in the 1950s.
I have one final question from Councillor Quacks, and then we will have to conclude the presentation.
I think that my question has been answered, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Quacks. Councillor Sayers, would you like to move and show appreciation?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr.
And
Chair.
Councillor Cooper, second. So Pete and Craig, thank you very much for coming in, and we'll make sure this information goes through to our staff for consideration for the forthcoming report. We've got a lot on our plate in terms of structure planning, huge demands, and if you go to our second business item today, you'll see even more demands backing up. So thank you. It's good that you've come here and represented your community and done really good solid homework to sit in behind the presentation. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you.
Structure plan basically is just about what the facilities, the infrastructure you're putting in place.
Oh, here it is. So that concludes our public input today, members. There is no local board input at this stage. There are no extraordinary items, no notices of motion, which brings us to our first item of real business for us to make decisions on at least, and that is item 9, and that's the Auckland Smarter Transport Pricing Project. And welcome David Hawkey and Josh Arbery. We have a PowerPoint. Members, you will recall we workshopped this as well, so the quick reference is on page 15 of the separate documents if you've got your hub open. And I have an added recommendation here and I will move, and I have a second from the Deputy Chair. The recommendations before us, with the addition of a C, it's coming up, requesting that the key project milestones be reported back to this planning committee on a regular basis.
How often?
Well, until we get into the early stages of the work, we won't know how often, but I assure you they will be reported back here on a regular basis. So, David, in your hands to open.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Honourable Mayor. Thank you, members. So I've got a presentation that I'll quickly run through the key points of the item, and then I'll take questions at the end of the presentation, then I'll put forward the item for consideration. I suppose to walk through the purpose of this report. Basically, this report is to update the Planning Committee on the progress to give effect to ATAP's, which is the Auckland Transport Alignment Project's recommendation to establish a dedicated project to evaluate smarter transport pricing in Auckland. And it also seeks confirmation of the delegation to the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor to provide political oversight and make formal decisions to progress the various phases of the project in accordance to Section 6.1 of the Terms of Reference of this project. Just to give a bit of an overview of the project's purpose and context, the Smarter Transport Project was identified and the ATAP's recommended strategic approach was adopted by Council in September 2016. As you'll see in the report, there was both, I suppose, a recognition of the opportunities that smarter transport pricing could provide, as well as some of the challenges of not having approaches to manage demand. There is a table in the report that shows that primarily one of the biggest modelled changes to Auckland's transport performance was when smarter transport pricing was included in the modelling. So the purpose of the project is to undertake a thorough investigation sufficient to support a decision on whether or not to proceed with inducing pricing for transport demand for management purposes in Auckland. Just need to be very clear, this is not about implementing or doing smarter transport pricing at this stage. It is very much the evaluation of the opportunity. It's a multi-agency project, which we are one part of, but also the New Zealand Transport Agency, State Service Commission, Treasury and the Minister of Transport are the key partners on this project. The project terms of reference was signed by the chief executives of all those agencies in late May, June, and the project was launched on the 7th of June. Jim Quinn circulated a memo with the terms of reference to all the members of this committee on the 7th of June. I suppose to understand the primary objective and scope of this project, the primary objective of the project is to improve the performance of Auckland's transport network primarily through reduction of congestion by enabling more efficient travel demand patterns. So that's the essence of it. But as part of that, and the next slide will go through, is that there'll be an investigation or consideration given to the broader effects that such a opportunity provides in terms of economic, social and environmental effects, and I'll go through those in a bit more detail in a second. Smarter pricing will raise revenue as part of any potential scheme, and the project will analyse in terms of options what that will mean, but ultimately the use of any revenue is not currently in scope of this project. In terms of the key considerations, as I said before, it's really and there's also an appendix in the report which goes into this in more detail. The key factors the evaluation will take into account are around ensuring the key impacts of pricing of those using the transport system is thoroughly understood, particularly in regards to fairness, equity and distribution effects. I can take questions at the end perhaps, are understood and addressed. That any pricing system is cost-effective to implement, operate, administer and enforce, ensuring pricing is flexible and adaptable to changing circumstances such as technology, ensuring that transparency of the use of any net revenue raised by a pricing system for demand managers in Auckland is understood, and understanding national and regional implications of any impacts, including effects on the existing land transport pricing system. So just to reiterate, the project essentially is an options evaluation exercise. In terms of the key deliverables and timing, and there is another attachment in the report that highlights some of the key tasks that are in the project, there are 3 distinct phases. And in effect, each phase is where there will be a recommendation to go to the next phase. The first phase is a progress report in November, which is really understanding and updating what is, I suppose, Auckland's future transport performance if there was no pricing put in effect. So there's actually a lot of background work in this phase to update things like the transport model to allow it to look at things like pricing. There will be identification of a comprehensive plan of engagement for the public and stakeholders, and there'll also be understanding of if, could there be demonstrations as a part of that sort of engagement. Phase 2 is, in effect, where the fundamental evaluation starts. We will move from an identification of a long list of potential options. These will be evaluated and refined to a short list of potential options, and that will finish in late 2018, date to be confirmed. And then phase 3, a final report in probably mid-2019, will be brought to the committee, which will outline the comprehensive evaluation, including cost-benefit analysis of the short list of options, and this will provide a recommendation on a preferred scheme pathway or future next steps for the consideration of the committee. In terms of governance arrangements, the terms of reference outlines these, but just to put in summary, Minister of Finance and the Minister of Transport are providing project oversights for Cabinet. For consistency and also to allow engagement with the ministers, it's proposed that the Mayor and Deputy Mayor provide oversight and make formal decisions to progress through the phases of the Smarter Transport project, and that says clause 6.1 of the terms of reference, and that's what we're recommending for adoption today. Deliverable at the conclusion of each phase will be provided to the Deputy Minister of Transport, Minister of Finance, Mayor and Deputy Mayor, will act as gateways. In practice, there's a lot of opportunities as a committee to engage in this process. We can provide updates and discussions at the planning bi-monthly workshops. Key milestones will be recommended to the reported to the planning committee, and at the end of the project, one of the most major decisions is really, in terms of the final options, what to do with those. So, our progress to date, it is fair to say primarily that the project has been in an establishment phase. It's been the partners have come together to bring together the terms of reference, and also identification of a project plan of work for over this time. There has been work on an evaluation approach, which is attached to this, attached to the report. There's been work on understanding some of the lessons that could be learnt from overseas smarter transport pricing systems, and there's been the development of a communications and engagement strategy. The last 2 parts there are currently being still discussed with the chief executives. So that comes to the end of my presentation, so I now open it to questions, and I'll take them as I come through you, I suppose, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, David. Questions at this time, members? Councillor Casey, question, and then
I've got 2 questions and I reserve the right to speak. Just to state up front, there were 2 votes against this road pricing implementation over 10 years at that confidential meeting on the 10th of September. One was myself and the other was Councillor Mike Lee. And I will be holding firm to that position today for a number of very good reasons. But my 2 questions. The first one is, I'm very surprised there's no local boards here today rattling spears, because I think you've done them a great injustice by assigning them to a communications and information strategy or something that hasn't even been written yet. No, I'll have a wee speech as well as the question, because people do that all the time. The reason I'm asking that question is
it's
that
moved and seconded, so you're welcome to make your comment now too.
what's happening here is we started with the public of Auckland, and we started with a mayor, not this one, who said there should be a referendum on road pricing. And now we've truncated that to almost alienate the public. By the time the public gets climbing back into this, it'll be down to options in late 2018, by which time there'll be no way you can change the options, because it'll either be A, B, C, D, or E. And if you want to change it, well, where's your evidence and what's your background? So what I'm suggesting is the public, which was back then invited to be part of this decision, has been written out of the equation. And the public is represented by us now and the local boards. But effectively, the local boards have been written out of this equation too. And I'll ask you to look at paragraph, whatever it is, 17, whatever it is, paragraph 26. And look at where the local boards have been put. It says, in parallel with the public announcement of the project, local board chairs were informed about the project and were sent the terms of reference. Whoop-de-doo. Next sentence. The communications and engagement strategy currently being developed, not written yet, will identify the ways local boards will be involved in the project. That is shocking. We are currently going through a governance review, looking at how we work with local boards, and to say to them, actually, we haven't figured it out yet. So my question to you is, where is that? No, well, it's not even a question, really. It's through the chair. I think that that's not sufficient, and I think we need to have an alternative way of communicating with the local boards over this really important matter, which changes the whole nature of transport in Auckland, and I'll come on to that later. So that's not good enough. In a yet-to-be-written strategy, that's the way we're going to do it, in a yet-to-be-written strategy. So I'd seek some comment from the chair or even from the mayor on that. Shocker, absolute shocker.
So look, I'll just comment at the outset, members, since the commencement of this term of council, both the Deputy Chair and myself have discussed how we communicate the agenda and all the items on the agenda more deliberately with local boards. Every chair and every relationship manager and every senior advisor receives this agenda, and it's been discussed at local board services as well. And our intention was to make sure that all local board chairs and senior management at local boards know about the content of agenda. It has been done so ahead of this meeting as well. We've received no call for local board input on this matter or any other matter on the whole of the agenda. And I make it very clear that that door is always open. Regarding the other question, I think there will be closer socialisation with local board chairs, and I know the Mayor has got a speaking opportunity or some questions later on. He might like to address that. That is the intention, but we're at the early stages here now, very early stages. That's my answer at this stage, Councillor Casey.
So that's one of my grievances. My second grievance is about the use of the money. In the report yourself, in your paragraph 17, like, this is about money, right? I know you're now calling it congestion charge and it's all about getting cars off the road, but actually this is about bringing in revenue. And for you not to be addressing where that revenue goes, when in your report yourself says it's more palatable to the public if they know it's going towards public transport alternatives to cars. So that's another thing. It's like, I do not understand why you're dressing it up as congestion charging, not admitting there is a revenue and this is where the revenue is going to be used. And until we've got public transport up to speed, you shouldn't be gathering any revenue. That's just an addition. So my question is, the revenue should be addressed. If you're bringing in revenue, that's what this is about.
Thank you. Have you finished your
So I'm suggesting that was a question to you, Mr. Chairman, whether you would suggest that this is in the scope of the project, because it's what this is about at base.
I will go back to the terms of reference and ask David to address the terms of reference as they apply to the question of the focus of decongestion versus revenue gathering.
I suppose just to, thank you, Mr. Chair, just to answer that, I mean, primarily, as I said before, this project is about using pricing for demand management. Undoubtedly, the revenue will be arose through such, if any. Yeah, well, I mean, that is the essence. I suppose the essence of any pricing scheme is you put a price and you hope that that will change behaviours around the demand for transport services, I suppose. So there will be revenue. However, if you do look at 4.2.4 in the terms of reference, it does state that the need for transparency on the use of any net revenue raised by any pricing system for demand management purpose in Auckland. So I suppose the terms of reference is trying to address the fact, yes, there will be revenue raised and it will be analysed as a part of the evaluation.
If I might just refer you, David, to your paragraph 17, which you say, in order to ensure the public acceptability of smarter transport pricing, the ultimate use of revenue, quote, needs to be the subject of separate discussion with government. It's not up there. So if that's in your report, that should be up there. It needs to be the subject of it. So where the money goes.
And I think that's what David has just referred to
Not
at
in the resolutions up
4.2.4, and it's there in black and white. It talks about transparency. So I think, in my view, Councillor, and I appreciate you being
He said
consistent.
it was out of scope, and if you go back to your slide, David, you said it was out of scope, correct?
Ultimately, I suppose, what it's saying is the, if you look at the 4.2.4, yes, the revenue will be analysed as a part of the project. However, how the revenue applied is outside of the scope of the project because it's involved in a broader discussion with government. So that, but it will be clear that any scheme that is proposed, if a scheme is proposed, the revenue implications will be understood.
I have Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure.
So the motion is moved, so speaking turns are welcome, two members.
So I've got a number of concerns, and they go to issues that I've raised before. First of all, my question is the first question is around the context of road pricing generally, and I think acceptance that revenue from fuel taxes is in decline and will go into sharper decline as we see electrification taking off, and that's generally accepted. It also fits with the Council's low carbon plan. Given that circumstance, a number of overseas cities and countries are looking at a smart network based on kilometre or miles travelled to fund transport costs generally. So coming to my first question then, is that general context going to be taken into account in this study?
I mean, I think absolutely. This came out of ATAP, and in terms of how ATAP looked at smarter pricing, this is the replacement funding tool. And I think, in the long run, once you have all your vehicles are electric and you don't have any fuel tax being raised anymore, then you need a system like this to both deliver you better transport outcomes, but also to provide you with the revenue. It's just whether there's extra revenue or whether it's replacement revenue will be figured out as time goes on.
So that means that the revenue that we're talking about is not just revenue that's being used for congestion purposes, but for general road transport purchases.
I mean, I think whatever, the revenue question is complex because there's part of it is like, does it offset existing funding mechanisms or is it in addition? And, I just keep going back to 4.2.4, which suggests that depending on the options and depending on that we are looking at, they will have different revenue implications. But, and I think what you're perhaps tying it to is the need for really good alternatives before you turn something like this on, and you need to find a way of funding those alternatives before you turn something like this on. And I think that's absolutely a core part of this project, is understanding what they are, when they will be available, and it could well be a very clear driver of the preferred options, at least in the short term, is, hey, what parts of the city do have good alternatives, because they might be the places that you start.
Okay, my next question runs with the last one, and that's around whether this study is going to look at the technology that might go to pricing but goes to a smart network. That is a network that identifies the vehicles, identifies where the vehicles are travelling, so that
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
enhance the network.
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate is this GNSS system where essentially every vehicle is known where it is and when it is. And, you know, that is the system that Singapore is in the process of implementing. At this point in time, it seems like a very expensive system, but I think as more cities around the world shift to that kind of system, which you can use for a whole pile of your sort of smarter approach to transport management in general, the costs will come down, and I'm sure that's the long run place that we'll end up is something like that.
So do these terms of references allow for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have Megoff.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Look, the first point I want to make is that this is something I think every councillor should support, because it is about collecting the information we need in order to make a decision. If you look at para 14 in the paper, a thorough investigation sufficient to support a decision on whether or not to proceed. So this is not about the decision to proceed, it's about getting the information to make the decision on whether or not to proceed. And the terms of reference, I think, are very effectively put together to answer the questions that we need to know. It's about fairness, it's about cost effectiveness, it's about flexibility and changing over time, it's about ensuring the transparency in the use of the revenue. So I wasn't anticipating that there'd be a debate about these recommendations. I am anticipating that there'll be a debate about whether this is the right way to proceed, and I'll partly engage in that debate. Firstly, about revenue, I've got a different view from some of those who have spoken. The ministers, when they first started talking about this, said they wanted it to be revenue neutral, so that if we raised money through congestion pricing, then that we would reduce the cost of fuel tax and road user charges. I was worried about the ambiguity. It didn't say that the congestion charging would take place in Auckland and the reduction in petrol tax would take place across the country. But I had that discussion with the Minister, and the ambiguity that existed has been taken out, so I'm pleased to report that. But in my view, this has got to be about two things. One, it's about changing behaviour, because we can provide a whole lot more infrastructure and spend billions of dollars more, but what we have to do is change behaviour towards public transport, towards active transport modes, and congestion charging, where it is operated across the world, has proven effective in doing that. We must change behaviour, because we don't want to, and we're not going to, spend billions of dollars building more and more motorways. We are about changing behaviour. But I've got to say, councillors, this is also about raising revenue, because if we want to change behaviour, we've got to have alternative, acceptable and convenient forms of transport to use, rather than us all lining up in the motorway in our 1.1 people per vehicle mode as we do at the moment. And everyone around this table knows that that figure of $7 billion deficit in the next 10 years for the Auckland Transport Alignment Project exists. $7 billion in deficit. It's real money we need, and we need to know where that money's going to come from. Now, at one stage, ministers were saying put it on the rates. I absolutely reject that. There is no clear connection between rates and use of transport in the way that changes behaviour. Rates means that you'd be applying the cost, as this council has done in the past, through the interim transport levy, to people regardless of whether or not they use the transport system. That seems to me to be dumb. Seems to me to be dumb that Sky City pays the same amount as a person on the minimum wage or a retired person out in the suburbs. So I reject the option of rates. The second one is fuel tax. You know my views about that. I won't go through it now. It's the quickest, most convenient, easiest way to do it, and we can raise the money now, and we need the money now. But at the moment, I haven't persuaded government of that. I intend to keep trying. The third suggestion was the one that this council adopted when it adopted the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, and that was to look at the concept of congestion charging, which could be tolls, or to pick up Wayne Walker's comment, it could be something more sophisticated. I've got to say I've looked at the more sophisticated system. Yes, it would charge you according to the time of the day and the level of congestion on the roads, but if you look at Singapore, they're having trouble with it. And if Singapore is having trouble with the technology and the cost, that should be a warning to the rest of us. So I'm a little bit nervous about leading the pack on saying we will have this global positioning satellite charging until we see it as a cost-effective way of doing it. And at the moment, I don't think there's evidence about that. So, but this report will be looking at what that is. And the fourth thing, of course, we can say, and it's an easy thing for all of us to say, well, the government ought to be paying more towards this out of existing revenue. That's true, but you can bet your bottom dollar that both the government and the rest of New Zealand expects us to be meeting some of those costs. So we've got to put our hands in our pockets as well. This is not going to happen immediately. Thank you, David. You've given us a 2-year time frame to make the decision. I would suggest there'd be at least 3 years to implement it if we made the decision. So you're talking about 5 years down the track. We need revenue now, immediately, so we need to consider that. But we would be stupid not to do this study. This study gives us the information basis to make an evidence-driven decision. So I would urge every councillor to support this paper. It makes sense. It's the logical way of doing it. It doesn't make the decision itself. It simply gives us the information to make the best decision for our city and community. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Councillor Clow?
Is that too loud?
We've already set up a committee a couple of years ago, and that took a year or so. We spent quite a bit of money. My question is, why is this going to take 2 years? Why not 1 year? Why can't? Because the bottom line is that's going to be into election year, therefore nothing will happen. It'll be an election issue. It'll come back and we'll talk about it in the new year again, and it'll be basically 3 years away before we even start to make a decision on the 3-year implementation.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And through the Chair, I suppose the summary work program in Attachment B tries to break out some of the key tasks. I mean, there are a fair number of tasks to do in effect, and I suppose the most important thing here is trying to balance the need for change and speed, and a speedy recommendation, with a thorough process that takes the public of Auckland with us. If you look at lessons overseas, the key challenge of these pricing and smarter pricing schemes is public acceptability. It's really having the evidence and ability to take, I suppose, the public with the evaluation. So a fair bit of this is really going very thorough, and its intention to do a very thorough study and to, I suppose, ensure that all the stones are turned, I suppose. You know, we were involved as officers in the planning part of this. We did say, could we push it a bit more? Is there things we could take off and move quickly? At this stage, that seems this is sort of what we need to do, and it's in line with international studies and evaluations overseas. So that said, we will be refining and evaluating the project plan as we go along, and if there's ways that we could move quicker and it made sense in terms of public acceptability and success of the project, we would be keen to do so.
Thank you, David. Councillor Clow.
So, given there have been so many studies done, why are we reinventing the wheel? I know we've got certain Auckland-specific aspects to it, but given there is a lot of work being done on this, why are we basically spending as long to come up with a study and results that are probably going to be fairly predictable on what's been done around the world? Why can't we cut
Well, I think the answer to that is that some have been successful and others have not been. The ones that have been unsuccessful have not been socialised with the residents of that city, or they have been on short time frames and not been thoroughly assessed. And then there are examples like Stockholm, where there was community resistance. It was introduced as a trial with acceptance from the community, and the community harangued its administrators not to stop the trial. After 12 months earlier, not wanting it, adamantly not wanting it. There are examples of Manchester that have not been successful. We want to learn from where it's also failed, not just been successful, because this has to endure beyond our lifetimes possibly. So I'm sorry I'm probably answering on behalf of the staff there, but we do need to do this well, absolutely thoroughly. Councillor Clow, do you have a further question?
No, I just stress that we do need revenue sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Can't agree with you more. Councillor Wayne Walker, speaking turn on this matter.
Yes, I'd like to speak to the matter. First of all, just want to agree with the Mayor. We need action, we need some money, and as much and all as this is going out into the future, a modest regional fuel tax at this point in time would meet our immediate needs. So my concern is, as much and all as this study might be going on, we need to do our own work to run alongside that, and that is imperative. The other concern that I've got, and it goes to the issue around socialisation, is what we could be doing now is doing the sort of trial that overseas cities are doing. Oregon, for example, I'm actually enrolled in their trial. These can be voluntary trials. We could kick this sort of thing off right now. We'd need some acceptance from the government, but there's no reason why we couldn't do that now. We'd get social acceptability. It can be based around the best technology, and that technology exists now. As far as the technology is concerned, and I hear some of the comments about problems, the enhancement in technology is occurring at an exponential rate. So we should not be basing our decisions on the technology now, but the technology that we can anticipate in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, and what the marketplace is driving. And that includes insurance companies and the like, who want to actually insure vehicles based on miles or kilometres travelled. And there are any number of companies, especially in the United States, that have apps now built around vehicle use. So there's a business model here, a private business model that runs alongside this. It really concerns me in terms of how we're doing this, and I'm looking at the steering group, that our council has some input into the process. And the reason I raise that concern is the previous process, which was the alternative funding study, just looked at dinosaur technology. It didn't look forward enough at value-added taxes. It didn't look at the GIS-based technology or smartphone technology. It was absolutely hopeless. So I hope that this study is comprehensive, is futuristic, and bringing the future forward in terms of application. And I say again, this council should take a lead and should embark on a trial. We could do that.
Thank you. Councillor Quacks, your call.
Yeah, thank you. My concerns, Mr Chairman, are somewhat similar to Councillor Clow's, because we've burnt a considerable amount of ratepayers' money over the years. We had the consensus building group back in 2013, 2012, looking at alternatives and congestion charging, and came out with a fairly lengthy report on that. Prior to that, we had another report which was Get Auckland Moving, which also looked at tolling. So we seem to already have done quite a bit of work, and there's absolutely no reference in any of these reports about the work that's already been done. Now, I think that the ratepayers would be a little cross to know that we've done all this work in the past, and that there's been no reference to this work going forward. And I would have expected some of that, and why has that not occurred?
Thank you, through the Chair. Well, in effect, it has occurred. There has been work done looking at international lessons, but also, I suppose, valuations that have been done in New Zealand before. I just said it was on this, in that part of that slide, that currently is findings as presented to the governance group. So those could be some good findings, I suppose, for a future bi-monthly workshop to talk about. I suppose in terms of this project, it is a more thorough evaluation, looking at a broader range of options. And I suppose I keep going back to the need for public acceptability and to do this thoroughly and to spend the time on it. If you look overseas, there often is a phase of acceptability around these projects. It starts off with a lot of enthusiasm, but as it becomes more real, the going gets tougher. So a lot of this is about ensuring that we have the right evidence to show that whatever way this is progressing, it will be a good outcome for Auckland.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I do support the work that going forward, but I do want to make the comment that, you know, we have burned a lot of ratepayers' money already on this, and to take another 3 years just seems an extraordinary amount of time to me, given the problems that we're currently facing.
Thank you, Councillor Quacks. I'd probably use the word invested a good ratepayer money in this, because the learnings out of all those bodies of work are sitting in behind this body of work and have been conveyed to Treasury, State Services, Ministry of Transport, our partners in this work, along with Auckland Transport.
Well, I don't know if the ratepayer would see it quite like that, Councillor Darby.
Well, we might have to do a job a little bit better in conveying that message, that it has been a good investment, and we'll take that note. I have Councillor Cooper for the next call.
Thank you. I won't speak long, Mr. Chairman, because the recommendation is just to delegate to the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor after all. However, I guess for me, as we've been talking about these things for a long time, even pre-amalgamation, and I mean, I do support, you know, it's pretty hard to get people to pay congestion charging when they don't have an alternative other than to use a car. And that was one of the reasons why Takuri City opposed tolling of the tunnel. I don't know if I would now, but at the time, because there was no busway, the train wasn't that great, there's really not a good public transport offering in West Auckland. So for me though, you know, we've never really done a full regional study at the state now, and we can't go out to the public unless we have that information. It's no good going out saying, what do you think of this? And they'll ask the questions and go, oh, we don't know. You know, that's the bottom line. We have to have good information so we can, you know, really communicate well and let people make really informed decisions about any kind of proposal that we might wish to go ahead with. So I do support the recommendations, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Newman?
Oh, Mr. Chair, look, I mean, I support this work, but it's always, you know, when in smarter transport pricing generally comes down to a debate about the merits of distance or time-based fees for travel. My prediction is that inevitably in this exercise we will be conflating outcomes. You know, is this a process whereby we are in the business of transport demand management, or are we in the business of pricing externalities such as carbon emissions, or are we in the business of raising revenue? And it seems to me that actually road pricing, congestion charging should be about pricing behaviours, but this is Auckland, so it always comes back to a debate about revenue. And the problem is that for this to successfully work, you do need to have alternatives to the car, and alternatives are not readily available for everyone, so people can't easily make an alternate decision to the car. Yeah. And that is a very, very big problem, and it risks the acceptability of this particular scheme to our constituents, particularly those of us who represent outer suburban communities, which are a long, long way from any kind of a dynamic integrated public transport network. The other thing, Mr. Chair, is that if this is about revenue, revenue for what? Is this about motorists paying additional revenue for more roading infrastructure, or is this about motorists paying more revenue that can then be allocated for public transport and then who's going to fund the maintenance of that public transport infrastructure. And so I think that there needs to be some reflection on that, because that's what our constituents are going to be pondering as we move forward with socialising this to the community. The other thing I would say, Mr Chair, is that the interim transport levy, nothing seems more permanent than an interim transport levy, given that that is a 3-year funding tool, and there is no alternate, it seems, on the immediate horizon. There will be, I foresee, a significant breach of faith, I suspect, if that transport levy is extended. And there will be some very difficult conversations that will need to be had in the long-term plan. And the one final thing that I would make, Mr Chair, is that this to me kind of feels like a continuation of revenue for the purpose of promoting the government's priorities for transport in Auckland. This is not necessarily about raising revenue for our priorities. This seems to me about the government's priorities for public transport and for roading infrastructure. And so the government policy statement on land transport takes primacy over the long-term plan. And, we could say, well, we've got ATAP, we're hanging on to ATAP. I believe that the ATAP will become increasingly subordinate to whatever the government wants to do in Auckland, as set out in the GPS, and that doesn't necessarily reflect all the aspirations that are had around this table for the kind of investment that we'd like in public transport.
Okay, thank you. Good points. Of course, ATAP has to reflect the GPS. The GPS is the lead document, but we'll be canvassing that in the near future. But I appreciate the points made. They're all good ones. Penultimate speaker being Councillor Watson.
Yeah, actually, it's more of a question, and it picks up on some of the comments some of the other speakers have made in terms of how transparent and communicative this project is, and we duly acknowledge the importance of that. We also say that the regular updates are just going to be going to this relatively confined group of decision makers. So I'm just wondering, in real terms, how open the 2-3 years are in terms of the people sitting around here in the local boards in conveying exactly what's going on. So we all know that different parts of Auckland, any different proposals might affect in a different way. How open and how immediate is going to be the relaying of where any particular point in the process is sitting is going to be for us? So this group's getting regular updates. What's the proposal for informing us, and how open is the whole thing? I mean, is it secret squirrel stuff, or is it going to be really, totally open and inclusive, as we seem to be suggesting, in order to win people?
Thank you, Mr Chair. Well, I definitely hope it's not a secret squirrel process. I suppose in terms of this committee, some of the options we have is we have the bi-monthly workshops, so we can bring back, updates and discussions from that. At the main phases, we can bring these to the committee as key milestones. There will be a communication plan has been established, and is currently working how best to do that. It seems to be thinking that one of the ways to get the most public interest is things like having a website on Auckland Transport website, but branded as part of a project. The idea is, as the findings of the project emerge, that there is constant engagement with the public, and the key reason for that is that as it becomes more real to people, people will have lots of ideas, and some of those will be very positive. Some of those, in effect, will not be correct. So we just need to ensure that the narrative around what we are finding is based on evidence and clear. So I suppose in some ways I could work with the chair here about those bi-monthly workshops as a first step to see what we wish to bring to the committee. And in terms of local boards, look, are very open to local boards being involved, and there's no intention for them not to be involved. It's parts of this evaluation more generally will be very important to them.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Now, I've had a further request from Councillor Casey to have another speaking turn. Councillor Casey.
I reserve my right to speak. I asked
Yes.
two questions, one about
I'll
local
just say,
boards and
Councillor
one
Casey, I'm about
use of
to
funds.
use Chair's prerogative and give you a second speaking
Thank you.
turn. It
I
is
didn't
a
speak before.
It is a second speaking turn because you did make comment. So, members, I'm just
Everybody makes comment.
I'm just
When
abiding
makes a
by the
speech, everything's
standing
asked a
orders
question.
that we have all signed up to. I am giving some leeway in this instance, but I will not necessarily continue to give that leeway. So, if at question time, make it clear it is a question. Do not lace it with comment. Put the question, please. Councillor Casey, your speaking turn.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chair. It's much appreciated. I won't abuse it. Look, Aucklanders have the right to a say in a major change to our infrastructure. Every Aucklander. And this is going to be a major change. And it seems to me that the last people who will have a say will be the public of Auckland in 2 or 3 years when our consultants have narrowed down the options to 1, 2, 3 and 4, and it's now on impossible to change it. If we had an integrated public transport system, if people could get around Auckland, where they want to go, at a price they can afford, with a reliable service, they wouldn't need to use their cars, and they wouldn't object to this. But this is way like 10 years too early, because we ain't there yet. And this is about revenue gathering. I've heard all the words. I've got over the years, I think we started with tolling, we've had funding tools, road pricing, we've got network charging, we've had congestion charging, and the latest one today, smarter transport pricing. Smarter transport pricing. It's not transport, it's cars, it's roads. Smarter. I don't know what smarter means at all. It just seems to me to be mystifying the process for the public. And it's a bit like Auckland Transport's calculator. They throw in all the stuff, they put in all the evidence, and out comes a priority list. And to try and change that as an elected member is now impossible. That's what I see happening here. And we're funneling it down, forgive me, just to the mayor and the deputy mayor. Well, I'm not actually supporting any of the recommendations, because as an elected member, again, I feel impotent. I feel like there is no job for me here other than to do exactly what I'm doing right now, to speak up for the people of Auckland. And, you know, gathering revenue by pricing our roads is not something I think you will get any support for at this stage, because I don't think the alternatives are there.
Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a smarter transport pricing project, and there's a lot that we need to learn about these things, because at the moment the work is not completed in Singapore. It is of a medium scope in Stockholm. It has failed in other cities. Councillor Walker was right in saying the technology is moving, but there are some really real challenges that the city has to face, that has been identified in the Singapore work. For instance, you need universal Wi-Fi and 4G to make the system work, a GPS system work. The GPS system does not work in motorcycles or cars that have flat or very steep windscreens. Think of trucks. It does not work where there's electrical interference or high levels of climate change as far as temperature is concerned, and humidity. There's a whole lot of challenges here that we have no options or optics over yet. So to take a stand about on one side or another is ridiculous, because you have not been given the information to make a stand upon. So personally, I like to get the information, get the knowledge, and then go out to our community with an informed set of viewpoints. One thing that we do know is our community's greatest frustration is congestion. One thing that we do know is they want alternative modes. Councillor Casey is also correct saying they want better PT. Yes, we all want better PT. Frees up our main arterials, frees up the motorway network, and enables freight and services to move more efficiently. The latest figures from the Chamber are talking about $5 to $7 billion of lost revenue for this city and region because of congestion. I haven't seen the modelling for that figures, but that's what I've been told. $5 to $7 billion. Imagine if you could unleash that each year, what it would do to our economy. So this program, I believe, strongly has to be supported. Let's look at Singapore, and they're not releasing theirs, if and when they do, until 2020-21. Because security of the system's a really big challenging issue, which is why a cell phone system won't work, in their opinion. This process has to be transparent, and we have to come back to the governing body and to the local boards as the stages progress, just like we did with the Auckland Transport Alignment Project. We need to be able to clearly articulate where we're trying to go. We can't build our way out of congestion. You can't just keep adding tunnels and lanes. It just becomes financially prohibitive. Alternative methods must be found, and they have to be funded. And to make the funding work, they have to be used. And where a congestion charge does work, it gives people a good incentive to change their way of behaviour for transport and for mobility, whether it becomes more active modes or more PT. So, Mr Chair, I'm all for getting the information to understand this is new world thinking. We want a new world modern city. We want good transport options. We need to understand the systems that go hand in hand with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Good debate, members. I'll put the motions before us here, A, B and C together. All those in favour say aye.
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 To the contrary, no.
No.
Declare that carried. Sorry, Councillor Casey, did you want record?
Yeah.
On A, B and C, or just A and B?
Not a whole lot.
Okay, you don't want... Okay, that's fine. Against A, B and C, Councillor Casey. Thank you. Members, we'll take a 5-minute refreshment break and come back here at about 11:03. Thank you, members. We now come to item 10 on the Planning Committee agenda, and that's the adoption of the refreshed future urban land supply strategy. And I have Amanda Harland, David Hawkey and Dawn Mackay reporting on this. And I think it might be in your hands to start, Amanda.
That's a good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to present a few slides to introduce the item, just to recap on the process to date and where the deliberations panel got to with the feedback. So the purpose of this report is to provide a summary of the feedback received from public consultation on the refresh of the future urban land supply strategy. It outlines the deliberations panel's recommended changes in response to the feedback, and it seeks adoption of the refreshed future urban land supply strategy. The strategy was adopted by Council in November 2015, and it is part of Council's wider approach to managing growth. Its purpose is to provide a strategic and proactive approach for when future urban areas will be ready for development. The strategy, 2015 strategy, had approximately 11,000 hectares of future urban land and an anticipated dwelling capacity of around 110,000 dwellings to be sequenced over 30 years. Significant changes to the future urban areas occurred through the adoption of the unitary plan last year. And these were particularly around increasing the size of some of these areas, live zoning parts of others, so that now we have approximately 15,000 hectares of future urban land with an estimated capacity of around 137,000 dwellings. A refresh of the strategy was therefore required to ensure that it reflects the unitary plan development opportunities. It was also an opportunity to align the strategy with recent technical work that had occurred over the last 18 months, and that is particularly in terms of the Supporting Growth project, looking at the transport networks within the future urban areas. So a revised sequencing was put forward to the Planning Committee in March this year, and that was approved to go out to public engagement. At that meeting, a deliberations panel was established to consider feedback and make recommendations back to the Planning Committee. Consultation was undertaken in March and April of this year on that revised sequencing. So this map shows the revised sequencing that went out to consultation. And there were a number of areas that were brought forward as part of that revised sequencing. There are also a number of areas that were moved back. And if you look at when I flick the blue areas on, just to get an idea of the scale of the areas that were actually moved forward in the revised sequencing, those areas are highlighted in blue. And in total, 3,800 hectares of land has been live zoned and sequenced now, and that includes the rural settlements. 3,500 hectares of land has been sequenced over the next 10 years. So in total, 7,300 hectares has been sequenced between 2017 and 2027. And that is approximately 65,000 dwellings. In terms of the overall strategy, the next 10 years worth of sequencing equates to around 50% of the total land area in the strategy. Then there's a number of areas that remain the same from the previous strategy. So in terms of public feedback, we received 191 pieces of written feedback and 3 petitions. Feedback was also received from the local boards and mana whenua. There was overall support, as with the previous strategy, there was overall support for having a strategy and having the sequencing. However, most feedback requested areas to be brought forward, and pretty much every area in the whole strategy was requested to be brought forward. Conversely, there was some feedback that requested areas to be put back in sequencing and timing, and there was also feedback that areas should be planned holistically rather than in an ad hoc way. So after considering the feedback, the panel recommends that the proposed sequencing be retained for all the areas, with the exception of Takanini, future urban area, being put back to the final part of the 30-year sequence due to significant geotech and flooding constraints, and an area in the vicinity of Cosgrave Road be brought forward. They also recommended that additional explanation in the text of the strategy to explain how structure planning and monitoring would be undertaken. They felt that that could be made a bit clearer. So the fundamental reasons for recommending the changes to the strategy include infrastructure constraints and uncertainties, and the need for holistic structure planning to occur prior to land being ready for development. And they emphasised that through the structure planning process, once all the information is understood and the urban form and the infrastructure constraints fully understood, that there is the option to look at bringing areas forward as appropriate. And generally the sequencing will be along the lines of the future urban land supply strategy, but there may be reason to bring areas forward for development once that structure planning has been undertaken. Also, there's a significant amount of greenfield land that is enabled now, as I said before, and over the next 10 years. So in total, 7,300 hectares is enabled in the next 10 years, equates to around 65,000 dwellings, which is nearly 50% of the identified future urban land. There are also significant costs to servicing this land that has already been prioritised early. So these are the 2 tables that are in the strategy that are recommended in terms of sequencing. And the left-hand table are the large future urban areas. The right-hand table are the rural settlements. So if you have a look at the first 10 years, these are the number of areas that have been prioritised over that period in the large future urban areas, and the majority of the rural settlement areas have been prioritised for that first 10 years as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I'd like to move the recommendations that we have on the agenda here, members, A, B, C and D, and I have a second from Councillor Newman, one of the deliberations panel members. So I'll move accordingly and put that on the table. Firstly, I'd like to take questions at this stage. Just questions at this stage, members. I have a question from Councillor Newman.
Amanda, thank you. Over here. So I was part of the deliberations panel. My question, in the unitary plan, the structure plan guidelines in Appendix 1 talks about having regard to strategies, including the future urban land supply strategy, but it doesn't necessarily require that there will be compliance with the future urban land supply strategy. Is that correct?
Yes.
My question, therefore, in relation to Upper Orewa area, because there was reference in, and it's set out in attachment B, at paragraph 9, the request to move the reference to resource consent process and to sequence. If there is no requirement to comply with the sequencing of the future urban land supply strategy. And if a location is infrastructure ready, is there really any relevance in maintaining the reference to the resource consent process if the site is ready from an infrastructure perspective?
So I guess there are two parts to that. Firstly, the panel felt that the infrastructure wasn't really ready in that
I was a
northern
minority in that position.
in that area. So particularly, I guess, in terms of the transport load on the network, the fact that that area of land is now part of a larger future urban area that would require structure planning to understand how that area fits into the wider network and the wider context of the other future urban areas and its connections to the existing urban area. And there was a second part I've forgotten, but basically the panel felt that it would hold off until the results of the hearing was understood, and that it would then adjust the future urban land supply strategy sequencing to reflect that. Now, there is a possibility of just including that area as part of the wider sequencing for the wider Wainui East area that sequence later. But the panel felt that we should really wait until the outcome of that process is known.
Just to follow up, Mr. Chair, though, it is the one location in a future urban area that has a hash over it with a note, reference to a resource consent process. So it's quite an extraordinary reference. And also, it's not necessarily germane to this discussion if the discussion is about infrastructure-ready locations. It might not be a location that we want, but if it's a location that's ready, then a question whether actually we should be making that specific reference to that particular location, given this is not a resource consent process. This is about a sequencing process to align locations with infrastructure-ready locations. I reserve my right to speak.
You will. Thank you. Questions, members? Okay, I will take them in this order. Firstly, Councillor Wayne Walker, Councillor Filipina, Councillor Cooper, and then the Deputy Mayor.
She knows I'm right.
Councillor Wayne Walker.
So, got a few questions. First off, in the recommendations, there's the tie between the sequencing and it says future long-term plans. And obviously the long-term plans are going to provide the money for the infrastructure. So am I to assume if there isn't money available in the long-term planning process for infrastructure, that an area doesn't go ahead?
Through the chair, I suppose what this does do is send out our intentions around rezoning of land. If sometime in the future the long-term plan doesn't have the infrastructure in place, in effect, I suppose the infrastructure won't be in place. So, in effect, you will have different outcomes for that area. And I suppose what the linkage tries to do in this is showing our intentions to provide that infrastructure to allow these areas to be urbanised. But that is a decision, I suppose, for future councils in the long-term plan. So they may decide that they don't want to do that. However, this, I suppose, strategy does not lock in future councils. It signals an intention of what we think would be a good outcome for Auckland.
Okay, my reason for asking this question is that there should be a incredibly powerful link between our intention to make land available and the money that we've actually got available to fund that infrastructure. And I'm not talking about money that's just available from the developer to fund the infrastructure in the vicinity, but the wider infrastructural needs. So that relationship, is it very clear to people?
Through the chair, I think it is clear. I think that is the essence of why we are doing sequencing, is that we have made statements that we can't afford to provide infrastructure everywhere in Auckland. So the idea of this strategy was to put forward those areas that we either have to provide infrastructure due to the unitary plan, but also areas based on a range of principles that would get good outcomes for Auckland to manage its growth. So I think, you know, if you really peel it back, the essence of the strategy is around the fact that we have to be financially prudent and try to get the best outcomes with the resources we have.
Okay, the other question I've got is just around the relationship between structure planning and the areas that are allowed for development. Does the structure planning process also include catchment plans for stormwater, particularly in areas, and I'm thinking around Silverdale Dairy Flat, where there are existing flooding problems?
Yes, structure planning, through you, Mr. Chair, includes all the technical work that's necessary to fully understand how that area can be developed and what areas need to be protected and what infrastructure will be needed. So yes, it does.
And the last question I've got just goes between the relationship of an area that might be developed relative to existing areas that have already been zoned that need to be taken up. And if I give you an example, we've got Silverdale North, where there's a very large commercial area that's been zoned and roads and the like are going in. That's a very significant development. Are we going to make sure that, say, commercial land that's made available in the Silverdale Dairy Flat area doesn't prejudice the uptake of an existing area that's already been funded?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the structure planning process is actually a really important process for that reason, because not only does it look at the land use requirements within the future urban areas, but it needs to look at the wider context and how it fits into to the existing urban area, what the relationships and connections are to the existing urban area. And there are a number of those examples around the region where structure planning needs to take account of the existing urban area requirements and future possibilities.
And just one last question, it just goes to structure planning and the relationship with transport. So is the structure planning process taking into account the wider transport network, for example, the provision of the busway north to Silverdale?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Councillor Filipaina.
Kia ora, Chair, and thank you. My questions are around the engagement, and I see under 19 of our page 33 that recommendation B was to prove a targeted public engagement. So I was a wee bit surprised when Councillor Casey pointed out on page 117, European 114 people, Māori were 1, Asian 23, but ethnicity other 1. And that's on page 117. We have a look at it. And I see on so it was a targeted, targeted public engagement, and I see there were only 7 public drop-in sessions. So have there been any lessons learned around the lack of Māori engagement and numbers, and also Pacific around it? Because, I mean, I don't see the southern areas with drop-in centres where there's and even out West Auckland, where the population is high in regards to Pacific. Māori, and I'm not mentioning a mana whenua because I've read the document in there, because I'm just a wee bit surprised that there was only 7, and you know, why wasn't there the ones out in Otara? Why weren't the ones out in Māngere? Why weren't the ones out in West Auckland? So that's just one question.
Amanda?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I take your point. Yes, the stats there reflect a low turnout. Our ability within the timeframes to undertake consultation meant we had to keep to about 7, I think it was, sessions at identified libraries, and they were in the key future urban areas rather than in the existing urban area. So I guess that could be a reason why.
Yeah, because I mean, it's from the 29th of March through to the 18th of April. So, Chair, I think my question is, well, no, my comment back to our team is, look, can we? I mean, there's a hell of a lot of people that have been missed out. I understand it's only between these times, but when you look at the demographics in regards to Māori Pacific, that's my issue, and there has to be lessons learned, because there's been a few other occasions around the engagement of our community has been lacking, and it's disappointing. But aroha mai, I will move on. Chair, there's also on page 116 of our agenda, and there's 2 local boards here, Māngere, Otahuhu and Manurewa. Now, those are the 2 local boards from me reading the feedback from attachment D. And these were the only 2 that raised the affordability issue. So whereabouts in the document, and I spoke to the chair earlier before the start of the meeting around the affordability issue with homes, and obviously we're not in the legislation around the SHAs anymore. So where is that in regards to this? And if you also bear in mind item 13 around that particular issue, so where are we at in regards to affordable housing? Because it is crucial, and Councillor Casey again pointed out there was an ability for the governing body to have a look at that affordability issue through the unitary plan process, and I may have voted against putting that into the unitary plan. If that's the case, well, you know, my apologies and my bad. But, you know, so where are we with that, through you, Chair?
Amanda?
Or is it just Jacques? I saw the old hand going, no, let me answer it. So,
Jacques, do you want to take that one?
There was a question.
Oh,
Do you
sorry.
answer or do I answer? Seeing I'm speaking, I'll answer. I suppose, Councillor Filipina, one needs to keep in mind what the purpose of the fulls is. And it really is simply about the sequencing and the servicing of the land. What happens on the land once it is live zoned, that is a completely different matter, but that is not what this document deals with whatsoever. So it is not possible for the future urban land supply strategy to deal with issues such as affordable housing. It is just not set up to do that. That is a detail that comes further. As you said, there was some attempt in the unity plan to have provisions around affordable housing. That did not make it through. So even requiring some degree of affordable housing in whatever form that might be, even that becomes a problem, because once that land is live zoned, it has to follow the rules of the unity plan. It's under the auspices of the unity plan. So in that sense, even then we would struggle to deal directly with affordable housing. Yeah. Okay,
so Chair, just a supplementary. So based on what Jacques has just mentioned, and again, it may well be a question in relation to item 13, but Chair, have you got in the program ahead, the forward program, any workshops that a discussion can take place around what we can do, as whether it be through here or the governing body, around affordable housing? Because I think it's important. I've spoken to some colleagues around this particular table, and it is an issue. And this is why I'm surprised that not many of the other local boards have mentioned that as a possible issue, apart from the two that we have in there. And I take on board what Jacques has said around this particular item not being around that affordable issue, but I just sort of table it with you, Chair. If there's an opportunity, I think we need to discuss around the affordability issue anyway.
Okay, so coming up at a workshop and then I think through formal report back to this committee, hopefully the next business meeting, we'll have an SHA, a Special Housing Area Monitoring Report.
Yep.
The data is due in for the period end of June in the next few days. Staff will be analysing that data and formulating a report, or at least some information that we could hopefully socialise through a workshop and examine some of those issues. So you will recall there was affordability criteria for SHAs. The Accord specified increased supply, affordability, and it also talked about increasing the skills or addressing the skills shortage. So I'd like to see not just numbers in terms of consents, builds, occupations, affordability, but to address the Accord in its full, covering those other aspects that I've just mentioned. So we'll hopefully you'll see on your diary coming up some time to discuss the very matter that you've just raised.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jacques.
Thank you. Other questions? I have Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. And I was on the panel as well, but I did want to raise the issue that Councillor Newman canvassed. I suppose my question is, we've talked about with the Arua West site, we actually said let's just wait and see what happens with the resource consent. But I'm concerned about adverse effects in terms of the outcomes that we want to achieve here if we just rely on the resource consent, because what we do if that resource consent's granted and it's still in deliberation, is we actually condemn that to countryside living, and it's supposed to be urban, because I can't see, developers are not going to wait 16 years when they've gone this far, and that's my concern when this particular piece of land could end up going ahead with 150 lots instead of 500, and that's not the outcome we were trying to achieve next to a transport hub. And so I suppose I want to ask that is that what I want to understand, because I still, even though our discussions in the panel, and I really respect we went through this, but I still was left feeling not quite comforted that leaving it to the outcome of a resource consent was actually going to give us the outcome that we wanted, either no development for 16 years or countryside living, which is not what this is actually planned for. So I guess that's where what I want to understand a bit better.
Can I just ask, I've had questions from 3 members of the deliberations panel, and I'm aware that the panel received 2 emails with the final draft, wasn't the final draft, it was a decision version for feedback, and then there was a second email also asking for feedback. Did the members that are raising those questions now, who were part of the deliberations panel, provide feedback at that time? Because my recollection is only member Namani as well as myself provided feedback. So I'm just saying it's a little bit odd at this stage to be providing that input if the channel which was formally provided was not taken advantage of.
Mr. Chair, I have no issue with the written report.
No, neither do I.
The written report is an excellent report. I raised questions when we deliberated on the locations, and I continue to raise those questions today at that location.
And same with me.
That's fair enough. I have further questions.
So can I get the answer? Because I do want to know what happens if we get that perverse. I don't think we're doing this to get perverse outcomes. We're doing it in good faith to stage growth, But this is quite different, and that's my concern, and I'd really like to answer, because I think everybody needs to understand that. I mean, it may be that it's, you know.
Amanda, can you reply to that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I understand what you're saying, and I guess there is a risk in deferring the allocation of a sequence, and I guess the obvious sequence would be, if there wasn't a resource consent process in train, the obvious sequence would be the later sequencing along with the other areas, but given the history of the site, there is a risk that it could go to lower density development if the landowners chose to go down that path. But the future urban zone was not intended for countryside living. It was intended as an urban zone. Countryside living is not an urban zone, it's a rural zone.
Right.
So, yeah, as I said, given the history of this site, there is that risk still that it could go to lower density.
So I guess that's the nub of my question, is why would we risk that? That's, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Cashmore.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and acknowledge yourself and the panel members who do this work. It's not easy. I was involved with yourself and Councillor Cracks in the first term, and it was certainly challenging. My question is purely, Amanda, around the structure planning process and how people who are not currently zoned in the first or second tranche can actually have a chance through a structure planning process to move it forward, which seems to be where the contention tends to be coming from. And I'm giving specific reference to, say, Helensville and also to Drury. So what sort of timelines are we expecting on those two particular case studies? So from the structure planning to the plan change to live zone.
Through you, Mr. Chair, what we've always said with the structure planning and plan change process is that it would take around 3 years to do the structure plan process and complete what effectively would be like the first stage of a plan change to release development for, release land for development and implement a live zone. So that we've said around 3 years, but depending on the scale, and you mentioned Drury, which is part of the south wider structure planning process that's been signalled. It is a very, very large area to be structure planned. So that 3-year process, just a guide, given it is an extremely large area, we don't know how long that's going to take. It will probably take a bit longer than the Whenuapai process given its scale, but what we aim for is that within that 3-year period. In terms of Helensville, Dawn Mackay here might like to comment on that.
Thanks, Amanda. I think there's also the issue of scale as a converse. So the Helensville example is quite a small piece of land. So, and my understanding is that there are a number of infrastructure issues, which meant that the timing has been put in that 2023 to 28 period, so that solutions for those can be found. But a structure planning process for a smaller area of land can be less than obviously the much more complex picture that you're going to get in a large area like the south.
Subsequent question, Mr. Chair. So, given the fact that a lot of these big developers, particularly in the Drury area, they are of substance, and many of them have been in the game a long time, and they have a lot of relevant information, what is the council's ability to absorb that information, peer review it, and move at a bit quicker pace?
Through you, Mr. Chair, well, I think it's all really good information that can be used for the structure planning process. There's other information that needs to be put into that process as well from other areas, from other landowners, from other developers in the area, and I guess it all contributes. And certainly having done a lot of that work could potentially help speed it up.
Thank you. I'll reserve my right to speak, Mr. Chair.
It's probably worth noting that is exactly what happened with Whenuapai. So there was quite a bit of information already there, and a number of the developers had information, and that made the whole process go a lot faster.
Thank you, Sharon.
Member Hinave.
I just want to, in relation to page 106, 117, and you've got in the bottom left-hand corner ethnicity. You've got one Māori. Was that Te Aki Tai?
I'm sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. We can't tell from this report. I'd have to go back to the original data.
Well, there's only one.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of page 125, you've got mana whenua engagement. You've got a pretty good report on, well, just basically the minutes of a meeting. I'm just wondering, what was the engagement with Mātāwaka? Was it? Was it?
With urban Māori?
That's what we.
You've through the chair, there were only 7 events that were provided for as part of the targeted consultation that we provided. So those were with local communities in areas that were on the periphery, such as, and these were the ones that were affected by the areas, the future urban zones. So they were in places like Warkworth, Papakura, etc. And we did consultation with mana whenua. We did not do consultation with Mātāwaka specifically.
Sweet. That was the hui on the 19th of April.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is the minutes, attachment F.
That's correct.
Cool. Further, you're fine, Member Hanare?
Yep.
Thank you. Any other questions, members? Members, I'm going to just open this up and speak to it myself as a member of the deliberations panel. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the staff. I just want to foreshadow that I do have an amendment coming, Councillor Sayers, so not ignoring you. There is an amendment coming, and I might refer in part to that amendment as well. But I will acknowledge the staff, Amanda particularly leading this refresh on the 2015 Future Urban Land Supply Strategy. I really want to acknowledge some superlative work that you've done, trying conditions. Dawn in support, David leading the infrastructure strategy team. But there's been quite a team, and it's taken a lot of quality human resource to get this far. In the strategy team, Tanya Mead, Elisa Jones and Murray Cameron, Luke Carey, incredible head for numbers that man has, Andrew Beer, and not forgetting our infrastructure partners who have applied themselves here as well, Auckland Transport through Gavin Smith, NZTA on behalf of the government agency, Craig Mitchell there, Watercare, our CCO, Chris Allen, and in our Healthy Waters team addressing stormwater issues, and they were considerable in the south of the city, Andrew Chin and Lisa Dawson. Plus my colleagues on the panel who include Councillor Newman, who has seconded the motion, Councillor Cooper, thank you, Councillor Wayne Walker, appreciate all the inputs there, Member Namani from the Independent Māori Statutory Board, and Councillor Dick Quacks in part as well. So the panel was established by resolution of us all here, as was the process. It was clearly outlined. We signed up for it. We have only conducted our business as set down by this committee. And we have made our recommendations here to you today for, hopefully, our collective adoption. It's been, I'd have to say, an open and transparent and inclusive process all the way. And we have received, as Amanda has pointed out, 189 written submissions. Not forgetting, of course, this is a refresh that we had even greater engagement when we went out on the first strategy in almost coming up a couple of years now. We had 2 deliberation sessions. There were numerous email exchanges amongst members and staff as well. They took place on the 15th and 22nd of May. A lot more further technical work ensued. Some pretty rigorous questions were put by our deliberation panel members at those lengthy meetings, and we had numerous parts of the organisation and NZTA as wide as that reporting back to us on matters that were being raised by the members of the panel. Stormwater from our Healthy Waters team proved a very big test in many parts of Auckland. And Councillor Newman, I really want to acknowledge your quite deep engagement in the stormwater space. Thank you. It was considerable, it was knowledgeable, and it made a difference. In the water and wastewater area as well, transport, huge demands there, and how to connect up these future urban areas to the core of Auckland where jobs might be, and where people just need to connect to. Either employment, it could be recreation, it could be education. But it is one network right across Auckland that we don't live in just in isolated parts of Auckland, that's for sure. So this falls, as I mentioned, updates the 2015 strategy, and it results, we had to do this because of the significant changes, and they're quite considerable changes, to the future urban areas brought about by decisions of the Independent Hearings Panel and ultimately ourselves here at the council table on the Auckland Unitary Plan last year. And that resulted in the need to undertake this. The final falls has been developed with an assumption that we'll be reaching by 2047 a population of 2.4 million. And is that enough? We might be asking ourselves. Well, we shall see, because the Department of Statistics quite recently are seeing us hitting 1.7 million maybe later this year, a considerable early target. And I think from memory, the 2035 target looks like it of 2 million is going to now be hit in around about 2028. That's 2 million, originally 2035, maybe in 2028. That's the phenomenal, that's an indication of the phenomenal attraction problem that we have created for ourselves in Auckland, and the phenomenal growth problem that is coming with that attraction problem. We completed this and when you combine it with the Auckland Unitary Plan, and you'll see in a later report there is reference to 95% of the Unitary Plan is now landed and operative, and only 5% of it is subject to appeal, be it judicial review, High Court or Environment Court, and we're working through those. But when you combine it all, we have certainly lifted the lid on land supply in Auckland for development. It's been made necessary because of this insatiable demand for housing and overall growth in Auckland, but not forgetting just housing. We have got to create employment for people, and we've got to create communities for people along the way. It is not just about opening up the land. It cannot be ad hoc as in the past. We are the first city in New Zealand that has embarked on such a long-term view. And I would suggest now that land supply, with the landing of 95% of the Unitary Plan and the future urban land supply strategy today, is not the key issue. It is about building on that. The development has now been made feasible. We've got to now embark on the next chapter and enable development. And that will be a big task as well. There's no shying away. So the Falls gives landowners, developers, investors across Auckland a clear view of a 30-year pipeline of supply, a 30-year horizon. And ultimately, this strategy will give clear and greater certainty to all of those parties, not forgetting current Aucklanders and future Aucklanders who require homes, who require jobs. So we have undertaken a rough infrastructure, or a rough order of costs for infrastructure moving forward, and you'll see it updated there in the strategy, of $20 billion. $20 billion. Now, it's fair to say The good lion's share of that is not budgeted for. And that hinges back to an earlier item that the Mayor just spoke to before. This is all interrelated, as is ATAP, of course, and we have tremendous challenges on our plate. But keep in mind also that that $20 billion of capital comes with some $40 billion of operational expenditure over future years, none of which is budgeted for. It really draws some focus on the enormous challenges that we have before us. While we have got over one hurdle in adopting this strategy today, it has really opened up the challenges that are before us in the next decade of budget, 2018-28, and the decades beyond, for Aucklanders all. They are phenomenal challenges, unseen in Auckland's long and grand history to date. So members, I will be commending, and I do commend, with the support of Councillor Newman and the panel members, that you adopt this strategy today. It doesn't suit all. People have made investments in land and they have thought that they would make the cut. For various reasons, well examined, they have not. But they may in the near future if we embark on the necessary structure planning. Not everybody's land can be included. It's just that way, but I assure you members, very keen examination of all those submissions has been undertaken. And while I acknowledge Councillor Sayer's good representation of his constituents, it is too late in the piece to make changes at this time. Those changes should have been telegraphed well before, and they were through the submission process. The deliberations panel have comprehensively, with the staff, examined all those submissions, and we have landed this recommendation for you today, and I ask you to lend your vote of support to adopt the future urban land supply strategy for the next 30 years. Thank you. Do I have other speakers? Oh, well, I'll go to Councillor Sayers in the first instance, actually. Councillor Sayers.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've got that amendment up there. The thrust of the amendment, Mr. Chair, is really looking at all of Auckland, not just a particular area, to allow council staff the opportunity on a case-by-case basis to look at certain parcels of land, to bring the sequencing forward on those if it meets certain criteria which are outlined in that motion. It's really about if there's some land that is so close to existing infrastructure that the applicant could prove, and the words I've used are careful, provide that enough evidence to satisfy council that that land should be brought forward in the sequencing, then we should have a look at it. The infrastructure exists, and the land's right beside that infrastructure. If the applicant can prove that they can bring that land forward in the sequencing process at no cost to council, can develop some more housing as it gets rezoned, and it can hook on readily to existing infrastructure that has the capacity, what this is suggesting is the opportunity for council to look at that. Also, obviously there's an opportunity for the landowner as well to provide that evidence and convince council that that is possible for their particular piece of land. So this would apply to, I suspect, a number of land holdings right across Auckland, Mr. Chair. Does that potentially raise issues with the Falls strategy? I'm suggesting it probably doesn't, but I'd like the officers to speak to that. And the reason why I'm saying that is that it has to provide the evidence that it's at no cost to council and that land can easily hook up to existing infrastructure, which ultimately, I guess the goal of all of this is some extra housing coming online sooner than currently planned in the current sequencing. So look, I would like to invite the General Manager of Auckland Planning and Research to comment through you, Mr. Chair, at the appropriate time on this amendment or addition, and to put it to the vote to see if my colleagues agree with it. And just in closing, introducing the item, it's about the applicant having to prove beyond reasonable doubt to the council staff that land is appropriate to bring forward. At the moment, I don't think the flexibility is there, other than following, as I understand, the processes that are available to them. That's through the structure plan process, Mr. Chair. So perhaps if we could talk a little bit about my recommendation versus current processes.
Thank you, and thank you, Councillor Sayers. Members, I have looked at the standing orders and whether I should, as Chair, accept this motion. Ordinarily, when we're dealing with a plan change, one does not accept late changes on a plan change. That would be out of order. But in this instance, the feedback from our Secretariat has been that it is within the standing orders. So I accept it, but I also remind the members of the thorough process that has gone through, the opportunity for public feedback, and I've also, at the outset of this meeting, I indicated that I declined in the public input part of the agenda, Mr. Nick Roberts, thank you, on behalf of clients who are landowners, significant landowners in Auckland, who were also wanting to be represented at this meeting. I declined that because on the grounds that a long and thorough process confirmed by us all had been gone through, and it was inappropriate. Otherwise, I would feel obliged, and I think the panel members too, you would feel obliged to open it up to every submitter, 189 of them again. We've gone through that process. But that's the backgrounder. I will allow Jacques to reply to the query on the impacts of these resolutions or motions.
I suppose I have to go back to the principle of why we are doing and have done the future urban land supply strategy. And a key reason for that is because the way that we've done things in the past has not always worked. We needed to find another way of doing it. Another key element is that the amount of land that we are talking about in terms of the future urban zone is nothing like we have ever seen in Auckland before. Simply the scale of that land, and therefore the size of the bulk infrastructure investment to be able to service that land. We are just talking about a completely different scale of things, like we've never had before. So I understand what you are saying in terms of a piece of land that may be relatively close to or adjacent to an existing urban area. However, I suppose there is the fairness approach in the sense that we have to treat all landowners equally. And therein lies the difficulty, because someone might be a small landowner versus a very large landowner. How do you keep the fairness in all of this? One of the key things that we have learned that is because of the size of the land that we are dealing with, smaller, so you're right, the only way that the evidence really can be provided in terms of the impact, mainly through the infrastructure, of live zoning land is through a structure planning process. So a landowner may have a view in terms of whether there's any impact in infrastructure impacts and costs that would fall to the council. But of course we can't just take the view of a landowner. We need to be sure that that is the case. Often there are impacts that go beyond the site. So for example, transport, often it generates greater traffic, and that has to be accommodated further down the side, and you need road windings and that kind of thing. So we need to be comfortable that there there are either no costs associated or that would land with the council, or that we can actually deal with those. So when you start looking at those kind of sites in isolation, one of the problems we do have is, because of the interrelationships and because of the size of the greenfield that we are talking now, we may very well be back to the stage where if you look at them individually, they do not form a whole picture. And you start running into problems with solutions that work for some sites but not all sites, and the issues around interim solutions and whether it is a double costing for in the future again. So in that sense, and bringing that back to the equity and the fairness, I think we start running into problems when we deal with small sites and start assessing whether they have impact in terms of that site versus the larger whole. And I really do think we need to, the whole purpose of the strategy was that we can put a logic in the rollout of infrastructure, and because of the costs associated with that, as Councillor Darby has said, the costs are massive. I think we just need to be really careful through an attempt like this, not to end up going back to what we used to do, which is there is no necessary logic in how we approach this and what we are then committing to in terms of the infrastructure rollout. We also have to remember, if I remember the number, I think it was 26%. So a quarter of the future urban land has already been live zoned, either through the Unity Plan or through SHAs. So there's a commitment that has been made now. We have to service that land. And so we always, if one looks at bits of land, it is all great if there may not be a major cost associated with our part of that. But there's the bigger picture in terms of there's only so much that the council can handle in terms of costs. There's always all these commitments that have already been made, and we just keep on adding to those. So it has to be seen in that context.
Thank you, Jacques. Amanda or Dawn or David, do you have anything to add regarding the motions? There was a request from Councillor Sayers, and I acknowledge that he invited
through the
staff.
Chair, I suppose just to emphasise what Jacques said, the attribution of cost is very difficult. You have a big area, it seems like it's only a cost for that site, but I suppose the externality cost for an area can be significant. One of the key reasons that I suppose we're recommending structure plan holistically for an area is that you can look at these things more broadly and piece together the best outcome. So that is the essence, one of the essence of the strategy in terms of its principles, that you look at a range of opportunities together, you seek something better, but you might get better densities. If you start to do bit by bit, you'll probably get unintended consequences, so there's a risk with that.
Thank you, David. And Jacques again.
You could have maybe just add another point. So, of course, in terms of the funding of the infrastructure, and that is a major constraint, but it may also very well be once you have done the structure plan and you understand the whole and what it takes to service that, all the funding does not necessarily need to come from the council, of course. We can make arrangements with the developers in terms of that funding. So the strategy does actually allow for that. It is actually quite clear. It has a statement there that once that structure planning is done and the implications of that is understood, that it may very well be that the sequencing within that area may actually change, and it may be different from the sequencing that is indicated in the strategy. But that is done on the basis that you understand the detail that comes with that. So the strategy does allow for that change in sequencing within those areas.
I'll go back to you, Councillor Sayers. Have you formally moved the motion?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Thank you, and it's seconded by Councillor Quacks. Members, I'm going to take the amendment first. So are there speakers to the amendment? Councillor Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. although I have some gut instinct support for what Councillor Sayers is trying to achieve here, we've had well explained to us about the importance of the structured planning, about the overall consequences of the neighbouring properties and the wider catchment or catchments. And to me, that's the most important thing, so that we don't get inadvertently walk into something that's going to cause us trouble going down in the future. And also, we need to be able to systematically, most cost effectively, provide the required infrastructure, particularly the in-ground infrastructure. Through the structure planning process, the comprehensive structure planning, we can get a good idea of the overall interdependencies and consequences and advance adjacent properties as what Councillor Sayers is trying to achieve here. So I think through that structure planning process, we probably have a preferred methodology that is more comprehensive and potentially sustainable and resilient than what we would have by doing sort of bespoke, siloed type advancements. So I will not be supporting the amendment. Sorry, Greg.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Cashmore. Sorry, Councillor Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I can just speaking on the amendment, I asked the question of the staff at the beginning of the debate. It was a bit of a rhetorical question, but if the structure plan guidelines in Appendix 1 of the unitary plan apply, and they do, when preparing a structure plan, you take into consideration strategies such as the future urban land supply, but you don't necessarily have to comply with it. So there's actually means to do this already. Yeah. The test comes down to whether the infrastructure is in place, and if the infrastructure is in place, then it would happen. So I don't support the amendment because I don't actually think the amendment is necessary. What I do think is necessary, however, is for there to need to be an acknowledgement that the future urban land supply does not usurp the unitary plan, and the unitary plan has a process around the preparation of a structure plan. So the structure plan can take place. The structure plan takes into consideration those matters that are required to be taken into account, and if the infrastructure can be negotiated with the CCOs such as water care, then the development could quite reasonably happen, notwithstanding some concern that people might have about the appropriateness of that development taking place at that particular point in time if it's out of sequence. So I don't think this amendment's necessary.
Are there further speakers? Councillor Wayne Walker.
The one issue that that I've got, frankly, it goes to development everywhere, is the necessity for us to put in place alternative funding tools. And we need those funding tools urgently. And I don't know how long that's going to take. We don't seem to be getting anywhere right now. But the last thing that we want to do is to open up areas of Auckland without those alternative funding tools. And that might mean special rates, value-added taxes, tax on capital, targeted rates, whatever, to make these areas allowable for development, because I just can't see the long-term plan delivering on them. So that's the particular concern that I've got. I'd be much more comfortable if we had those funding tools in place now, but we ain't.
Thank you, members. Just briefly, myself speaking to the motion, I don't commend this motion for support, and I acknowledge the member for his work in this regard, but I would suggest this is the area that we need to move away from rather than to. We've undertaken a lot of ad hoc responses to land use planning in Auckland. Hopefully with the Auckland Unitary Plan 95% landed, and in a few minutes hopefully the future urban land supply strategy landed, we will start to work to a long plan which has got room for variation. As Councillor Newman has just reminded us, I would suggest that this is looking in the rearview mirror as to how we have behaved in the past. So I don't recommend you support the motion. There being no more speakers, I will put the...
Just the right of reply, if I may,
absolutely.
Mr. Chair, just to close things.
You don't get a right of reply on an amendment, I don't believe.
Oh, you don't? Oh, okay.
Under the addition.
Then shall I speak?
Sorry, you are welcome.
Okay, so thanks. Very quickly, Chris. Appreciate the debate. that's occurred around this. But just to reinforce, this isn't about having to spend money on new infrastructure or having to raise new funding tools. What this is angling at is the infrastructure's there, it's got capacity, can be linked up to, and the ability for a landowner to convince council on its terms that it should be brought forward in the sequencing process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, councillor. I'll put the amendment to the vote. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. No. Declare that lost. I'll move to the main motion. Are there further speakers on the main motion? This is A, B, C and D. Do I have further speakers on the main motion? Councillor Newman, I thought you wanted to speak to the main motion. You did indicate earlier.
Well, Mr. Chair, yeah, look, I want to acknowledge the work of the staff. They've done a fantastic job in trying to synthesise a lot of complex information into a coherent narrative around this report, and the background information has been very impressive, so I do congratulate the staff. I would personally, Mr. Chair, like to think that in adopting a recommendation D, that there is an opportunity to revisit the reference to the resource consent in Upper Orewa for the reasons that I set out in my questioning. But I'm not going to pursue that beyond that particular comment. I do want to note, Mr. Chair, that look, I put my hand up to push back in relation to Takanini North because the evidence that was set out in the council's own submissions on the unitary plan in topic 017, Rub South, to the independent hearings panel, made it quite clear that the initial cost estimates for development in Takanini North for the notified future urban zone location was in the region of $300 million, and if you extend that to include land outside of the notified fuzz location at Takanini North within the Papakura Stream catchment, the cost estimate goes up to $500 million. And the updated information that we got from Healthy Waters at that location actually firms up that estimate of cost. For a location that is significantly constrained by its geotechnical profile and wouldn't get you the kind of yield of residential dwellings to even come close to justifying that spend. So I think that the recommendation, which includes pushing back Takanini North to the back end of decade 3, is pertinent, and I will cop the odium from the landowners in that area because of my advocacy, but it was the right thing to do. What I do think, Mr. Chair, in adopting the future urban land supply strategy is there is going to need to be more work done by our plans and places team around how we approach future public plan changes to ensure that these locations are not just left as locations that fall into the never-nevers and we are just reliant on resource consent applications coming in which are non-compliant for land use activities which are out of sequence and not complemented by the infrastructure at any given point in time. Because that's what's happening in parts of my ward and that has to stop. So I will be taking that matter up with the relevant staff and advocating back to this committee when the opportunity arises in the future.
Thank you, councillor. And your Three Waters knowledge was invaluable through the deliberations process. Any other speakers on the main motion? This is A, B, C and D. If not, I will put them. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare them carried. Thank you. And thank you, Amanda and your team.
Thank you.
Members, we'll go straight through to item 11, and I would like to finish the open agenda before we take a lunch break, I think. If we can, we'll see how we go. We'll go to plans and places, and that's the statutory work program. I believe this is straightforward. Do I have a mover for the statutory work program? Deputy Chair, Councillor Denise Lee. Do I have a second?
I will second.
Councillor Cooper, thank you. And we have for this always different names on the list to the ones that pop up. John Durgood, Phil Reid. We've read the report that you've penned here, I think, Phil, or Jasmine, wasn't it? Yep. And Tony Reedy and Phil, you're here for them. And John, is there anything further you would like to add? I think it's pretty clear.
No, we're happy to just answer any questions.
Questions, members? There being none, I will put it to vote. All those in favour? Member Namani.
Kia ora, John. Just a bit curious, and it could be that you know, it hasn't necessarily been scoped out yet, and that's part of the whole work program. Just keen on whether you've thought about what the role of mana whenua mātāwaka might be in monitoring the effectiveness of the unitary plan. Wonder if you've kind of put thoughts to that, and also know you're looking at the new amendments to the RMA in relation to the mana whakahono arohi iwi participation agreements, and also acknowledge that at perhaps a different level other agreements are being developed, and you know, there's potentially duplication there, and I just wondered, is that all kind of being thought about at this point in time? Has it been landed?
Yeah, so through the Chair and Phil may be able to add to this, but in terms of your first question around monitoring the unitary plan, there is a piece of work underway already where we are working with mana whenua on the cultural impact assessment, or the CIA provisions in the unitary plan, or rather the cultural impact assessment process that Council is undertaking. So that's a piece of work that the research and monitoring unit within Sharks area are undertaking with our support, and we've got good engagement from mana whenua. So that's a very specific topic, but the broader involvement of mana whenua in monitoring the unitary plan as a whole, not just the cultural values side of things. It is early days. We would like to come back to the committee. We will come back to the committee with an overall monitoring framework, and as part of that, very definitely talk about how we will engage with and involve mana whenua in things like how well is the unitary plan protecting the coastal environment, water quality, biodiversity, and cultural heritage. So early days yet, that's probably all I can say.
I might just add to that a little bit through the Chair. So the iwi participation agreement approach under the Act does provide for, when iwi do approach us to invite us to enter into an agreement, for the monitoring of the effectiveness of the plan to actually be a specific part of that discussion. So we are anticipating that could well actually be part of what does happen over the next year or so when those requests come in.
Because a request isn't that hard to make, and it could come tomorrow.
That's right.
So I'm just wanting to kind of get a sense of the readiness and kind of the, you know, at hand around that. And I think perhaps at some point in the future it would be really helpful to understand that, not as a subset of the broader stuff, but actually in relation to the RMA and mana whenua and some of the changes, and how this council's going to kind of manage that, potentially across things that aren't, I'm just thinking relationships, agreements, generally, and how the two dovetail. There's just something in there that'll be really helpful at some point to kind of get a report back.
So absolutely, again,
if at all possible, or if useful.
So through the Chair, in terms of the wider discussions with mana whenua around relationship with Council, that work has been led by Te Waka Angamua, but we're working, the Plans and Places Department, Te Waka Angamua and IMSB Secretariat are starting to develop some ideas around broader agreements with mana whenua, and in particular the mana whakahono arohi provisions in the RMA now, and how that all stitches together. So I'll speak to Graham Pryor in Te Waka Angamua, and we'll work out the right forum to bring back a report to this committee or the governing body on that.
Okay, that's really positive that attention's been about integrating that, because there's potentially a lot of duplication of effort that's unnecessary.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Councillor Casey, question?
Yeah, just following on from a question my colleague Councillor Filipina asked a wee bit earlier about special housing areas. We know how many houses are being built through the unitary plan, but do we know how much low-cost housing is being built? Is there any monitoring of filling that gap?
This report addresses the appeals, and as I replied to Councillor Filipina before, and I think you are referring to some news that's been on the RNZ today, possibly. And that will be addressed in a forthcoming workshop, for which I've requested information on a status monitoring report on all our SHAs, on supply, and the number of dwellings built, the number of affordables as per the criteria under the Accord. We will have all of that at the workshop. The data, as I mentioned just before, for the end of June is just coming in. So,
thanks, Mr. Chairman. It's just that in the report itself there is discussion of monitoring of the unitary plan. It was just a...
It's the monitoring of the SHAs as opposed to the planning.
No, specifically I'm asking now about the unitary plan. We know how many houses are being built. I'm asking about low-cost housing. Is there any oversight of that?
Of the unitary plan?
Well, through the Chair, as part of an overall monitoring of the unitary plan as a whole, there will be a component around housing supply and potentially within that the impact of the unitary plan on affordability. There's a lot of work happening in that space through the Chief Economist's Office, REMU, Research and Monitoring Unit. We're not leading work around monitoring affordability ourselves in the Plans and Places Department, but take the point as part of monitoring the unitary plan, housing supply and affordability within that is a component of what should be monitored. So when we come back with the monitoring program for the unitary plan, you can expect to see something on that.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Just a question of clarification, maybe you, Mr. Chair, or John. We don't have a mechanism in the unitary plan to around retained affordability, do we? Because we didn't vote for that in the unitary plan. So there's no ability to monitor that in terms of that mechanism because we don't have it. Is that right? I'm just getting confused about all these questions because we didn't put that into the unitary plan.
No, inclusionary zoning was lost by a vote by the former council.
Divided.
Thank you.
So members, it's moved, it's seconded, and I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye. 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 Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you, Tony Reedy, the author of that report, down in the starboard quarter there. And we'll now go to item 12. Sorry, item 12, is it?
Yep.
Oh, where am I? Getting ahead of myself. No, that was the statutory frame. We're now at 12. I'll move receipt of this. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Councillor Simpson, thank you. John, and Tony on this one, sorry. John, your intro.
All right, so really this is a good news story about progress with the Auckland Unitary Plan appeals. All up, as stated in the report, we had 108 appeals to the High Court and the Environment Courts combined, and we're now over halfway with 60 of the appeals settled either through negotiated agreements endorsed by the Planning Committee or the delegated members of the committee, or through court decisions, or in some cases we have had appeals withdrawn for various reasons. So that's the headline, really. Tony has a bit more detail than that if you have any questions, or other than that, we're...
Questions, members?
Don't stop.
Don't stop.
It's a good story, and look, I'd like to again just acknowledge the Deputy Chair, Councillor Denise Lee, Councillor Mike Lee, Councillors Hulse and Filipina and Member Namani, and myself. We're involved, we're the delegated councillors and members, I should say, dealing with the appeals, be they High Court Environment, judicial reviews, etc. Started out with 108, we're well over halfway through them. But I'd also like to acknowledge the big team you've got in behind you, John. This has been an enormous task. I know in some cases appeals have been withdrawn at the last minute after all the evidence has been written by your team and other consultants. and it's only at the 11th hour when that evidence is lodged that appellants have seen that it is not worth fighting, if I can put it as simply as that. So this is, there's a tremendous resource that's sitting in behind this member. It's a lot of good people, highly talented, and we've got 5% to go, and we'll see how that looks like at the end of the year. John, you hopeful?
Yeah, very helpful. I mean, there may be a couple that carry over. You'll see on paragraph 5 of the agenda, there are some topics going to a hearing fairly soon in the Environment Court. So those are some of the trickier issues where we just simply haven't been able to reach agreement with the appellants and avoid a hearing. And we thought that some of those may go into the next calendar year, but it looks as though even those tricky appeals will be heard this calendar year. So potentially we might have all of the appeals resolved by the end of 2017.
Great story there for the whole council, I think. So thank you. Any further questions? Comment? All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. I heard lots of ayes there, so I'll carry it. 13. Unlock all papatoetoe.
Lock it up, isn't it?
John, welcome.
Thank you.
I will. Do I have a mover? Councillor Filipina is not here. Would somebody?
I'll move it.
Yeah. Mayor Goff, appropriate. Papatoetoe lad. Already passed. So it's moved by the mayor. Do I have a second?
Yeah.
Councillor Newman, thank you. It's there, John. We've read the report.
It's all right.
It wasn't.
I'm happy to unlock.
You're so similar, those two.
Mayor's the one with the keys to the city. He's the only one that can do that.
Seconded by
So they say.
Member Canali. Thank you. John.
Thank you for this opportunity to present the old Papatoetoe high-level project plan. I think it represents a really important step in our efforts to regenerate this town centre, and really, starting with town centres around Auckland. It's noted that we've previously been to a planning workshop on this matter in May, but I have put together a brief presentation. But I'm happy to skip that, or if the committee wants me to.
Members, in your hands, but this was socialised at a workshop.
Yep.
I think we went over this.
Very good.
Would members, well, I'd invite the questions. If there's outstanding questions post that workshop, you can ask them now, and maybe we'll proceed to the presentation, or are you all happy? I take it as content and a willingness to proceed. John?
Okay.
Thank you for your work. It's moved, it's seconded. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Declare that carried.
Thank you very much.
It may look like this was very easy, John, but we know that there was a long road into this. And thank you to your team.
Thank you.
Well done.
Sadly in need of it.
So, members, we'll now just go to 14 with procedural, I think. Staff aren't here to answer questions on this as is per normal. Deputy Chair, would you like to move? Second, please. Can I take a second on these? Councillor Cooper, thank you. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you, members. We'll conclude the open part of the agenda. We'll adjourn now. Oh, I need to exclude the public.
I'll move that.
It's procedural motions moved by Councillor Simpson, seconded by Member Namani. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. So we'll now move into public excluded, and we will adjourn for 30 minutes. Good timing. It's right on 12:30. We'll come back at 1. Half an hour sufficient? Yes? 1 o'clock we will reconvene to consider 2 of the 3 excluded items.
Go and have some lunch.